A gentle hush falls over the beginning of our story, and before we wander into the depths of Greek mythology, let us simply settle into stillness. The night is quiet, the air is calm, and this moment is meant only for rest, for imagination, and for allowing the mind to drift into worlds long past. This tale is one of enchantment and strangeness, of gods and mortals, of danger and wisdom intertwined, yet it is told here not in the rush of excitement but in the slow cadence of a bedtime voice. As you listen, you are invited to let go of the day's troubles and allow yourself to be carried gently back through time, to an age when myths were not merely stories but explanations for why the world was the way it was. Greek mythology is often filled with battles, storms, and thunderous events, but not all stories strike with the force of lightning. Some whisper like the sea at night, lulling, mysterious, and slow-moving. The story we are about to explore belongs to this softer kind. It is the tale of Circe, the enchantress of the island of Ae, remembered as both healer and deceiver, feared for her power and sought for her wisdom. Her story is not only about magic but about transformation, solitude, and the timeless questions of what it means to live with power and with exile. This introduction is a space to prepare the imagination, to set aside the harsher edges of myth, and to embrace the softer qualities of listening. You might picture yourself lying under the wide Greek sky, stars glimmering faintly above, while waves brush the shore of some forgotten island. You might imagine the faint glow of a fire, or the scent of herbs on the evening air. These are the kinds of images that accompany Circe, whose presence always lingers somewhere between comfort and danger, somewhere between rest and unease. Tonight, though, we focus on the gentler side of her story, allowing it to unfold like a dream. Before the journey truly begins, it helps to remember what myths were for the ancient Greeks. They were not only entertainment, but lessons, memory keepers, and soothing explanations for the mysteries of life. To sit by a hearth or within a temple and hear such stories was to be reminded of both wonder and caution, of beauty and sorrow. So too with Circe's tale, which asks us to consider how power can be used, how isolation can shape a soul, and how love and fear intertwine in strange ways. It may seem odd that a story filled with transformations, men becoming animals, heroes confronting witches, can become a tale for bedtime. Yet in its dreamlike quality, in its slow rhythm and mysterious images, it becomes just that. There is no rush here, no urgency, only a slow unfolding, as though the story were rising and falling with the tide. Each word can be allowed to rest before the next one arrives, each image lingering like the last notes of a song carried on the wind. Imagine, for a moment, the timelessness of the sea. The Greeks themselves were a people of islands and coasts, always surrounded by the rhythms of waves. Circe's island, too, lies in the midst of the ocean, touched endlessly by the same patterns of rising and falling water. Just as the sea holds its rhythm, so too will this telling. Slowly, gently, like a vessel drifting across calm waters, the story will carry you onward, not to startle, but to soothe. This opening serves as a doorway. Beyond it lies the wider tapestry of mythology, the gleam of gods, the wanderings of mortals, the strange half-world of enchantresses who exist somewhere between the divine and the human. Circe belongs to this twilight space, neither wholly feared nor wholly loved. And while many retellings of her myth emphasize her dangers, here we will also explore her loneliness, her wisdom, and the quiet moments that gave her story its shape. So take a breath, long and slow, and let your body relax as the words weave around you. Let your mind drift as if you are floating towards Circe's island, carried gently by unseen tides. There will be no need to hurry. Each turn in her story will come in its time, like waves brushing the shore. All you need to do is listen, allow the mind to wander, and let the enchantress of myth step softly into the quiet of your evening. In this way, the beginning prepares not only the story but also the listener. For mythology, when told slowly, becomes less like a lecture and more like a lullaby, full of images that fade in and out like dreams. And Circe, with her herbs, her potions, and her spells, is perhaps the perfect figure to guide us gently into such a state. Her voice in the myths was said to be both alluring and dangerous, but here, tonight, it may as well be the sound of calm itself, carrying us into sleep. Through the course of this tale, we will come to see Circe in many lights, daughter of the sun god, sister to queens and kings, solitary inhabitant of her island, guide of Odysseus, mother of children who shaped later myths. Yet all of these identities circle back to the same mysterious presence, a woman who lived apart, who held strange power, and who lingers still in imagination. Before her story begins in detail, we rest here, at the edge of myth, looking out toward her island across calm seas, and preparing to step into her world with patience, gentleness, and the openness that stories always invite.
The world of Greek mythology is vast, ancient, and endlessly layered, a realm where every mountain, river, and island carried a story, and every name whispered on the wind belonged to a god, a hero, or a creature unlike any other. To the Greeks, mythology was not a collection of fairy tales for idle amusement, but a living framework through which they made sense of their lives, their landscape, and the mysteries of the universe. For them, to tell these stories was to connect heaven with earth, the divine with the mortal, and the natural with the supernatural. Tonight, as we move closer to Circe's tale, it is worth pausing in this larger world, so that her story can be understood not as an isolated tale, but as a part of a grand, interconnected web of meaning. Imagine, for a moment, the land of Greece itself, rugged coastlines bathed in golden light, mountains rising dramatically against a sky that always seemed to shimmer with divine presence. The people who lived in these lands were seafarers, farmers, and warriors, their lives shaped by the unpredictability of weather, harvests, and war. To them, it was natural to see the divine in everything. The thunder was Zeus, the sea's temper was Poseidon, and the warm rays of the sun were Helios, the titan who also happens to be Circe's father. In this way, Greek mythology was less like a distant set of legends and more like the daily heartbeat of existence, woven into every sunrise, every storm, and every voyage across the Aegean. The myths varied depending on who told them, yet the underlying themes always returned to questions of power, destiny, pride, and transformation. Some myths roared like storms, full of clashing gods and wars of epic scale, like the battles at Troy, where heroes like Achilles and Hector met their fate. Others hummed more softly, dwelling on transformations, punishments, and the strange consequences of divine meddling in mortal lives. It is in these quieter corners of mythology that we find Circe, her tale unfolding not on the battlefield but in the hushed isolation of an enchanted island. The ancient storytellers, Homer, Hesiod, and later poets, wove these myths into songs and verses that could be carried from one generation to the next. Their audiences would listen by firelight, perhaps at sea, perhaps in crowded marketplaces, absorbing not only entertainment but also lessons about how to live and what to fear. When Homer sang of Odysseus meeting Circe in his Odyssey, listeners were not only following the journey of a weary hero, but also hearing a story about temptation, caution, and the limits of human strength when faced with divine magic. Greek mythology always balanced two currents, the grand and the intimate. On one side stood the Olympian gods, shining in their splendor, engaged in cosmic struggles. On the other side stood figures like Circe, liminal beings, not quite gods, not quite mortal, yet essential in guiding, testing, or challenging the heroes who crossed their paths. These beings, often female, often mysterious, represented something less straightforward, something that could not be conquered by brute force alone. They invited reflection, patience, and a deeper understanding of human vulnerability. To step into Circe's story, then, is to enter a myth that whispers instead of shouts. She does not arrive with thunderbolts like Zeus, nor with the ocean's fury like Poseidon. She waits quietly, tending her herbs, singing to her animals, preparing her spells. And yet, despite the softness of her presence, her story ripples outward, affecting kings, sailors, and even the gods themselves. This is one of the contrasts that makes her tale so enduring. She is not the loudest figure in Greek mythology, but she is one of the most haunting. Greek myths often carried moral weight, reminding listeners of the dangers of pride, of the inevitability of fate, or of the need to respect the gods. In Circe's tale, the lesson is subtler, bound to themes of transformation and the peril of underestimating what appears gentle. For when Odysseus' men sat at her table and ate her enchanted food, they discovered that what looks welcoming can sometimes conceal danger. And yet, when Odysseus himself proved immune, Circe revealed another side of herself, one of generosity and wisdom. In this duality lies the heart of Greek storytelling. the recognition that no figure, divine or mortal, is ever entirely good or entirely evil. As you listen to her story, it is helpful to think of Greek mythology as a tapestry. Each thread connects to another. Circe is tied to Helios, her father, whose light governs the skies, to Pasiphae, her sister, who became entangled in the strange myth of the Minotaur, and to Eets, her brother, who guarded the golden fleece sought by Jason and the Argonauts. These connections remind us that no story stands alone. Every myth reflects and refracts another, like stars in a constellation. And so, before we set foot on Circe's island, we take this moment to breathe in the broader atmosphere of Greek myth as a whole. A world of gods who punish and protect, of heroes who rise and fall, of enchantresses who both heal and harm. It is a world where the boundaries between the human and the divine blur constantly, where each story is both dreamlike and instructive, frightening and comforting. As the pace of this telling remains calm and steady, it is important to remember that the Greeks themselves often listened to these tales in the dark, by the sea, or within the glow of a fire. Just as you are listening now, they too found in these stories a way to drift into reflection, perhaps even into sleep, carried by words that stretched beyond time. To them, mythology was not about urgency but about rhythm, repetition, and the timeless comfort of hearing once again how the world came to be the way it is. Circe's story belongs to this rhythm. She is not at the heart of Olympus, nor does she lead armies into war. Instead, she exists at the edges, in the margins, quietly powerful, always waiting. And it is often at the edges of myth, in the quiet and the overlooked, that we find the tales most suited for nights like this, tales that comfort, that intrigue, and that lull us into the soft embrace of rest.
Circe enters the story not as a roaring goddess of thunder, nor as a warrior queen commanding armies, but as a presence wrapped in mystery and shadows. She is an enchantress whose name carries both allure and fear, a figure whispered of in ancient songs and remembered in the hearts of sailors who feared to stumble upon her island. To the Greeks, she was a being unlike most others, not quite fully divine, yet not human either. Instead, she existed in that in-between space, at once beautiful and terrifying, welcoming yet perilous. When one first encounters her through the words of Homer or later retellings, Circe seems at once both ordinary and extraordinary, her power cloaked in calm domesticity until, with a flick of her hand, the world transforms. Her reputation spread in two ways, through rumor and through myth. For some, she was a sorceress to be feared, a woman who could turn men into beasts and who delighted in doing so. For others, she was a healer, skilled in herbs and remedies that could soothe pain or prolong life. Even her name seems to carry the echo of mystery, evoking circles, cycles, and enchantments that never quite end. The duality of her character, nurturer and destroyer, host and deceiver, ensures that she resists simple definition. And it is perhaps this complexity that makes her one of the most enduring figures in all of Greek mythology. To picture Circe for the first time, one might imagine a solitary woman moving gracefully through the halls of her island home. She is not surrounded by attendants or heralds, for her isolation is part of her story. Instead, she tends to her animals, wolves, lions, and other creatures that once were men, while her cauldron simmers with herbs drawn from the forests and fields around her. The very air of her island hums with magic, though softly, like a lullaby on the edge of sleep. Circe's presence is both magnetic and unsettling, pulling travelers toward her while also warning them that danger lies close at hand. In the ancient imagination, Circe embodied something that was both desired and dreaded. For male heroes like Odysseus, she represented the risk of losing control, of being drawn away from the duties of war and voyage into a world of temptation and rest. Yet she also symbolized comfort and healing, the chance to pause after years of hardship, to enjoy the gifts of food, drink, and care. The paradox of Circe lies here. She is both the danger and the reward, both the test and the respite. To step into her presence is to confront the ambiguity of desire itself. But Circe was more than just a character in a single episode of Homer's Odyssey. She was a type, an archetype, the figure of the enchantress that haunted Greek storytelling. Unlike goddesses of the Olympian order, she lived apart from the central dramas of divine politics. Unlike mortal women, she held powers beyond human reach. She was neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, and so she became a liminal figure, inhabiting the thresholds between categories. This in-betweenness is essential to her myth. She is both divine and not divine, both human and not human, both nurturing and deadly. Her story, then, is not about resolution but about tension, about holding opposites together in the same figure. When Circe first appears in Homer's Odyssey, she is described with a kind of reverent dread. The sailors find her home on the island of Ae, and though it appears inviting, filled with singing and the scent of food, the men know that what waits inside is not simple hospitality. She greets them with warmth, offers them drink, and then, with a simple gesture, transforms them into pigs. This act, shocking and cruel, cements her reputation as a dangerous sorceress. Yet even within this scene, there is something more than malice. For the Greeks, transformation was never only punishment, it was also revelation. To become an animal was to reveal one's inner nature, to show what lay beneath the surface. Circe's power, then, is not only destructive but also reflective. Her role as an enchantress carried deep symbolic weight in Greek thought. Women who wielded knowledge of herbs, of healing, or of charms were often seen with suspicion. Their independence and their wisdom were both threatening and irresistible. Circe was a goddess daughter, born of Helios, the sun, but she chose not to dwell among gods or mortals, setting herself apart. In this separation, she became the embodiment of female autonomy, a figure who lived on her own terms, who did not seek approval from Olympus, and who answered to no mortal man. This independence, radical in the context of Greek society, became another reason why her myth clung to tones of fear and fascination. To take a first glimpse at Circe, then, is to feel the pull of contradiction. She is both protector and predator, both comforter and captor. She invites weary travelers to rest, but the price of that rest may be transformation. She offers knowledge, but that knowledge may unsettle more than it soothes. She embodies the dangers of curiosity and the temptations of straying from one's path. And yet, without her, Odysseus' journey would not be complete, for she not only tested him but guided him onward, preparing him for trials still to come. As we first step into her story, we do not yet judge her as good or evil, saint or monster. Instead, we allow her mystery to unfold, softly, like the rising of the moon. She is an enchantress, yes, but also a mirror, reflecting fears, desires, and questions that still resonate across the centuries. To know Circe is to encounter not certainty, but complexity, a reminder that some figures in myth are meant not to resolve easily but to linger in the imagination, haunting us with their ambiguity. And so, the first glimpse of Circe is like seeing a flicker of firelight in the distance, at once inviting and dangerous, beautiful yet unsettling. She stands as a figure of both enchantment and warning, her presence drawing us closer even as we hesitate. In her lies the very essence of myth, the blending of wonder and fear, the merging of dream and reality, the reminder that stories are not always meant to comfort, but to stir something deeper within the soul. Circe's story cannot be understood without first pausing to look closely at her family, for in Greek mythology, lineage was more than ancestry, it was destiny. The family a figure belonged to shaped their powers, their relationships, and even the myths in which they appeared. Circe was not a solitary invention, she was born into a remarkable bloodline, a family that touched many corners of Greek myth. By exploring her parents, her siblings, and the connections that tie her to gods, monsters, and heroes alike, we begin to see how Circe herself inherited a place both luminous and troubling in the tapestry of myth. Circe's father was Helios, the titan of the sun, whose golden chariot rose each morning to pull the light across the sky and descended each evening into the western waters. Helios was older than the Olympians, belonging to the generation of titans who ruled before Zeus and his kin overthrew them. Though many titans were cast down into the depths of Tartarus, Helios retained his place in the cosmic order, honored as the ever-watchful eye of heaven. His role as the sun god made him a symbol of unrelenting clarity. Nothing could be hidden from his gaze, no secret kept from his light. For Circe to be born of such a father meant inheriting not only divine power but also an association with knowledge, illumination, and the inevitability of revelation. Her mother, Perse, was an Oceanid, one of the 3,000 daughters of Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world. Unlike Helios, who blazed brightly in the sky, Circe embodied the flowing, secretive nature of water. She is a lesser-known figure, but her presence in Circe's lineage is important. From Circe comes a connection to the elemental depths, to the hidden and the mysterious, to the quiet currents beneath the surface. Thus, Circe's very blood was a union of opposites, the blazing clarity of the sun and the flowing secrecy of the sea. Her powers, which dealt with both revelation and concealment, with healing and harm, reflected this mingling of light and water. Circe was not an only child. Her siblings, too, played important roles in Greek myth, and together they form one of the most extraordinary families in the tradition. One of her brothers was Aetes, the king of Colchis, whose name is forever tied to the tale of Jason and the Argonauts. Aetes was the guardian of the Golden Fleece, that radiant treasure sought by Jason and his band of heroes. He was a figure of both hospitality and danger, welcoming Jason into his realm but also setting him nearly impossible tasks. It was Aetes' daughter, Medea, Circe's niece, who betrayed her father to help Jason succeed, using her own magical powers inherited from the family line. In this way, Circe's bloodline connects directly to one of the most famous quests in all of mythology. Another of Circe's siblings was Pasiphae, who became the queen of Crete through her marriage to King Minos. Pasiphae, like her sister, was marked by a blend of divine power and tragic destiny. She became infamous for the unnatural passion inflicted upon her by Poseidon, which led to the birth of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull creature who haunted the labyrinth. From Pasiphae's line came Ariadne and Phaedra, both of whom played roles in later myths. Thus, through her sister, Circe was tied to yet another corner of the mythological world, the terror of the Minotaur, the heroism of Theseus, and the tragic fates of Minos' daughters. A third sibling, Perses, is less prominent but still noteworthy. He was associated with destruction and often cast as a figure of violent, chaotic energy. If Aetes and Pasiphae represent the rulers of kingdoms and the shapers of great mythic events, Perses represents the raw, destructive power that lay dormant in their bloodline. Together, the siblings reveal the full spectrum of Circe's heritage, from kingship and rule to tragedy and chaos, all born from the same union of sun and sea. This family tree places Circe in the heart of mythology's network. She was aunt to Medea, that brilliant and terrifying sorceress whose love for Jason drove her to betray her father and whose rage led her to commit unspeakable acts. She was sister to Pasiphae, whose curse gave rise to one of the most haunting monsters of all time. She was daughter of Helios, whose all-seeing eyes made mortals tremble. Each connection deepened Circe's complexity, ensuring that she could never be reduced to a simple enchantress on a lonely island. Her blood tied her to quests, to tragedies, to heroes and gods alike. It is worth pausing here to reflect on what such a lineage meant for Circe's identity. She was neither fully Olympian nor fully Titan, neither entirely divine nor wholly mortal. Instead, she belonged to the shifting borderlands of myth. Her father's golden light gave her an aura of inevitability. Her magic always revealed something hidden, whether in the nature of men she transformed or in the guidance she gave Odysseus. Yet her mother's oceanic depths gave her secrecy, solitude, and the mysterious independence that defined her life on Aa. This dual heritage made her at once radiant and obscure, feared and sought after. Family in Greek mythology often dictated fate, and for Circe, this fate was not to rule on Olympus or to dwell among mortals, but to live apart. Her siblings shaped kingdoms and legends, but Circe remained solitary, removed from the centers of power. And yet, it is precisely this distance that gave her strength. She was not caught up in the quarrels of gods or the politics of kings. Instead, she carved her own place, her island becoming both sanctuary and prison, a realm that reflected her independence. To understand Circe's family is to see the threads of myth that extend outward in every direction, binding her to Jason's quest, to the tragedy of the Minotaur, to the all-seeing chariot of the sun. It is to realize that her story, while quieter than those of her siblings, was no less essential. For where her family's myths often roared with drama and violence, Circe's myth whispered with enchantment, offering transformation, guidance, and reflection. She was born of light and water, kin to rulers and monsters alike, and yet she stood apart, her tale destined to unfold in its own slow, dreamlike rhythm. The island of Circe's home, occupies a place of both geography and imagination. For the Greeks, who lived by the sea and sailed constantly between islands, the notion of a mysterious, enchanted isle was not far-fetched. Yet Ai was more than a dot on a map. It was a space outside of time, a liminal world where ordinary rules faded away and the boundaries between the human and the divine dissolved. To speak of Circe without speaking of her island is to leave half her story untold, for Ai was not merely her dwelling, it was her reflection, her sanctuary, and in many ways her true companion. In Homer's Odyssey, Ai is first introduced as a place of uncanny beauty, a haven that glows with a strange kind of warmth. When Odysseus and his weary sailors approached it, they saw forests dense and alive, streams flowing with silver brightness, and smoke curling gently into the sky from Circe's dwelling. The very air seemed saturated with fragrance, the scent of herbs, of flowers, of something more elusive and magical that lingered just beyond description. For men who had endured storms, shipwrecks, and endless wandering, the island must have appeared as a dream made real, a place to rest at last. Ai's beauty was not simply for show. It was deeply tied to Circe's magic. The island was alive with her presence, infused with her art of herbs and spells. The beasts that roamed freely across its glades were no ordinary animals. They were lions and wolves, but curiously tame, moving not with wild ferocity but with the docile calm of domesticated creatures. These, of course, were once men, transformed by Circe's enchantments. And so, even in its beauty, the island carried an undertone of unease. Nothing was quite as it seemed. The trees whispered with secrets, the animals gazed with human-like intelligence, and the landscape itself felt as though it were enchanted into eternal twilight. To imagine Ai at night is to picture an island bathed in moonlight, the sea lapping gently at its shores, and Circe's song drifting faintly across the air. It was both idyllic and unsettling, both inviting and dangerous. This is the paradox of the island. It offered peace, food, and rest, but also transformation and captivity. Just as Circe herself embodied contradiction, so too did her home. It was sanctuary for the lost and a snare for the unwary, a place where heroes might find solace or lose themselves entirely. The Greeks often used landscapes in their myths as reflections of inner truths. Mountains symbolized divine aloofness, rivers carried associations of life and death, and islands often represented isolation and liminality. Ai was no different. It was far from the centers of human life, a place unreachable except by chance or by fate. Its isolation mirrored Circe's own solitude, her distance from both Olympus and the mortal world. To set foot on Ai was to enter her realm completely, a realm governed not by the laws of Zeus or Poseidon but by Circe's own will. In this way, the island itself became an extension of her magic, a kingdom of one, shaped entirely by her presence. What must it have been like for Odysseus' men to wander through its glades, their hearts torn between relief and suspicion? On one hand, they found streams to drink from, meadows soft for resting, and the promise of hospitality. On the other, they were met by strange animals that watched them with uncanny eyes, and by a silence that seemed to hide something unspoken. The house itself, described as built of polished stone, gleamed with the refinement of a goddess touch. Smoke rose from her hearth, carrying the fragrance of her brewing, a signal that they were expected, perhaps even awaited. The island was also a space of transition. In mythology, travelers often moved through landscapes that transformed them, preparing them for trials to come. Ai was precisely such a place. For Odysseus, it was not just a pause in his journey home but a test of will, a confrontation with temptation, and a moment of guidance. For Circe, the island was her refuge and her exile, a place where she could exercise her powers freely but also remain apart from the larger world. It was both haven and prison, its isolation giving her freedom but also loneliness. Beyond Homer's account, later poets and writers expanded upon the imagery of Ai. Some imagined it as lush with orchards, heavy with fruit, and abundant with herbs known only to Circe. Others emphasized its remoteness, placing it at the very edges of the known world, where the sea faded into mystery. The details varied, but the impression remained consistent. Ai was an island unlike any other, a place where the normal order of things did not apply. In this way, Circe's island is as important as Circe herself. Without it, she would not be the same figure. It is the island that gives her space to practice her craft, to brew her potions, to tame her beasts, and to live apart from the politics of gods and men. It is the island that receives Odysseus and his men, becoming the stage upon which one of the most famous episodes of the Odyssey plays out. And it is the island that lingers in the imagination, even after the story is told, as a place that is both dream and danger. To dwell on Aaa is to sense its timeless quality, the way it hovers between reality and myth. One can almost hear the rustle of leaves in its forests, the low growl of a lion that is not quite a lion, the bubbling of Circe's cauldron as she stirs her potions. One can almost see the weary sailors stepping ashore, glancing around with a mixture of relief and dread, wondering if they have found safety or doom. And in this imagining, the listener, too, steps onto the island, carried gently by the current of the story, moving deeper into the world of Circe.
Circe's magic was unlike the thunderbolts of Zeus or the trident of Poseidon. It was quieter, subtler, and closer to the rhythms of the earth. Where the Olympians relied on force and spectacle, Circe relied on herbs, whispers, and the intimate knowledge of how nature could be coaxed into transformation. This distinction mattered deeply to the Greeks, for it placed Circe outside the familiar hierarchy of power. She was neither a goddess of war nor of the harvest, she was something far more ambiguous, a weaver of enchantments who blurred the line between divine majesty and mortal craft. Her primary tools were her herbs, gathered from the wild places of Aaa. Each plant carried its own essence, bitter leaves that could muddle the mind, blossoms that could calm the body, roots that unlocked visions, and seeds that could twist the shape of one's being. Circe knew them all, their seasons, their secrets, their precise measures. In myth, she is said to have used pharmaca, the Greek word that encompasses both remedy and poison. To the ancients, this duality reflected a truth: the same plant could heal or harm, depending on the hand that prepared it. Circe's mastery lay in her ability to tilt that balance, to make herbs obey her will. But plants alone were not her art. They were only ingredients in a greater act of transformation. With them, she brewed potions, stirred into cups of honey-sweetened wine, designed not just to intoxicate but to alter the very nature of those who drank. In Homer's tale, Odysseus' men tasted such a mixture, and in an instant their forms melted away. Their limbs twisted, their bodies shrank, and soon they were not men at all but swine, squealing and helpless. The shock of that transformation lingers in the imagination even now, a vivid reminder of how easily humanity can be reshaped. Yet Circe's power was not only in potions. She sang spells, her voice carrying a cadence that resonated beyond sound, a music that bent the will. Ancient poets spoke often of the enchantress whose words themselves were magic, weaving snares around the hearts of those who listened. To hear her song was to step into a dream, to be lulled into surrender, to believe safety was at hand even as danger closed in. In this, Circe resembled the sirens of Greek myth, though her power was deeper, for she did not merely lure sailors, she remade them. Transformation is the heart of Circe's magic, and in many ways, it is also her metaphor. To turn men into beasts was not only to punish them but to reveal something of their true selves. Were her victims pigs because she willed it so, or because their gluttony and folly already aligned them with swine? The Greeks often saw mythic transformations as mirrors of character, outward changes that reflected inner truths. In this sense, Circe's magic was a kind of revelation, stripping away the facade of humanity to expose what lay beneath. This power, of course, unsettled those who heard the tale. For men in particular, the thought of being unmade by a woman's hand, of losing their form and freedom, was both terrifying and humbling. Circe's enchantments thus carried a moral weight. They reminded listeners of the fragility of identity, the ease with which strength and pride could be reduced to helplessness. But they also suggested the possibility of renewal, for not all her transformations were permanent. Just as one could be reduced, one could also be restored, if one approached her with respect or cunning. Her magic had another quality as well: it was deeply tied to solitude. Unlike the Olympians, who wielded power through dominion and control, Circe worked alone, her enchantments born from patient practice rather than divine decree. There is a quiet intimacy in imagining her at her hearth, herbs spread across a polished stone table, cauldrons steaming with fragrant mixtures, the crackle of fire illuminating her watchful face. She did not hurl lightning, she stirred, she sang, she whispered. Her magic was as much craft as miracle, as much learned skill as inherited gift. This closeness to craft linked Circe to other figures in Greek thought, healers, midwives, and practitioners of the old herbal arts who lived on the edges of society. Such people often bore suspicion, for their knowledge was feared even as it was needed. Circe embodies this paradox. She was feared for her power to reshape, yet she was sought for her ability to aid. Later myths remind us that she did not always use her art for harm. She gave advice, offered warnings, and helped heroes when it suited her. Her magic was not evil by nature, it was, like the plants she used, capable of both destruction and salvation. And so, Circe's sorcery stands apart in the world of Greek myth. It is not the blinding terror of divine wrath but the slow, careful unfolding of transformation. It is not the roar of thunder but the whisper of leaves gathered under moonlight. It is not distant, abstract, or cosmic. It is immediate, personal, and deeply human in its touch. Perhaps that is why her story lingers with such vividness. To imagine her magic is to imagine not only the turning of men into beasts but the fragility of our own identities, the ease with which what we think we are can shift into something else. Her magic invites us, too, into reflection. If Circe's craft reveals the beast in men, what might it reveal in us? If transformation is always possible, then perhaps her island was not only a place of peril but of discovery. In her potions and her songs lies a truth the Greeks never forgot, that change is always near, and that the boundaries of who we are can be as fluid as water, as malleable as clay in the hands of an enchantress.
When Odysseus and his weary sailors finally reached the shores of Ae, they were men worn down by storms, hunger, and endless wandering. Their journey from Troy had already carried them through horrors and temptations, from the land of the Lotus Eaters to the terrifying cave of the Cyclops, and now, their sails brought them to an island that shimmered with deceptive peace. Ae seemed to promise rest, food, and safety. But as so often happens in the world of myth, what looked like salvation was a test, and Circe waited at its heart. The encounter between Circe and Odysseus' men begins with exploration. After anchoring their ships, Odysseus divided his company. Half stayed by the shore, exhausted and cautious, while the other half set out to scout the island's interior. Among them was Eurylochus, a wary companion whose sharp instincts would prove both helpful and troubling. As the men wandered through the forests and meadows, they came upon Circe's dwelling, a house of polished stone, surrounded by tame wolves and lions that padded silently among the trees. The strange thing was not their presence but their demeanor. These wild beasts did not attack, instead, they wagged their tails, moving as though they were hounds welcoming their masters. The men, uneasy yet intrigued, did not realize that these were no ordinary animals but men transformed by Circe's sorcery. The house itself gave off the smell of herbs and smoke, a beacon of domesticity amidst the wild. From within came the sound of singing, Circe's voice weaving through the air, carrying a cadence that was both sweet and strange. Drawn by her song, the men approached. Circe appeared, not as a monstrous figure, but as a radiant woman, beautiful, gracious, and seemingly hospitable. She welcomed them with warmth, invited them inside, and prepared them a feast. The table was laid with rich meats, bread, and sweet wine mixed with honey. For men who had eaten poorly for weeks, this hospitality felt like a gift from the gods themselves. But in that wine was Circe's potion. As the sailors drank deeply, their senses clouded, their bodies weakened, and before they could grasp what was happening, the enchantress touched them with her wand. In an instant, their forms dissolved. Arms shrank into legs, voices broke into squeals, and human reason melted into the instinct of swine. Where once there were men, now pigs grunted and shuffled about her hall. Yet Circe's magic was not cruel in a simple sense. The pigs retained their minds, trapped within their animal bodies, conscious of what they had lost. It was this detail that made the transformation so chilling, not only the loss of form but the continued awareness of their fate. Eurylochus alone had been cautious. Sensing a trap, he had remained outside while his companions entered. When the doors closed behind them and their cries faded into silence, he fled back to the ships, terror-stricken. His words, delivered breathlessly to Odysseus, painted a picture of doom, the men had vanished, and a goddess of dangerous power was to blame. The camp erupted into grief and fear, but Odysseus, ever determined, resolved to confront Circe himself. Here the story takes on the familiar rhythm of myth. The hero sets out alone, facing danger that could consume him, yet aided by fate. As Odysseus strode into the forest toward Circe's dwelling, he was met by Hermes, the messenger god, who appeared in the guise of a young man. Hermes knew Circe's tricks and came bearing a gift, the plant moly, a magical herb with black root and white blossom, said to shield mortals from enchantment. With this protection, Hermes instructed, Odysseus could drink Circe's potion without harm, resist her wand, and turn her power back upon her. The gods' council gave Odysseus not only a weapon but also a strategy. He was to threaten Circe, force her to swear no further harm, and thus bend the encounter to his advantage. Armed with moly and Hermes' guidance, Odysseus pressed forward. The scene of his arrival mirrors that of his men: the house, the song, the beasts, the table of food and drink. But when Circe offered him her wine, Odysseus drank it without fear, for the herb guarded his body from its effects. When she touched him with her wand, expecting his form to twist into that of a beast, nothing happened. Instead, Odysseus drew his sword and rushed upon her. For a moment, the roles reversed. The enchantress stood in fear, confronted by a mortal who had resisted her art. Circe, however, was not without wisdom. Seeing that her power had failed, she did not press the fight. Instead, she swore an oath, binding herself not to harm Odysseus or his men. She restored the companions she had transformed, washing them clean of their swinish forms, bathing them in her palace until their strength returned, and making them whole once again. The men, shaken but relieved, wept as they regained their human bodies, embracing Odysseus as their savior. The initial encounter with Circe thus unfolded not as a simple tale of doom but as a layered story of temptation, transformation, and reversal. Her magic, which seemed irresistible, was undone not by brute strength but by cunning, divine aid, and Odysseus' unyielding will. Yet it would be wrong to think of Circe defeated. For even in this confrontation, she shifted roles from captor to host, from enemy to ally, showing the fluidity that marked her character. The Greeks listening to this story would have felt both fear and fascination, a goddess who could destroy men in an instant, and yet, once resisted, could welcome them as guests. This first meeting set the stage for all that followed. Odysseus had faced Circe and not only survived but won her respect. The men, however, had seen firsthand the peril of succumbing blindly to comfort and temptation. The island of Aea revealed its double nature: paradise and prison, rest and ruin, all depending on how one approached its mistress. And so, the episode becomes more than a tale of sorcery. It is also a meditation on vigilance, on the dangers of surrender, and on the resilience required to confront forces that would strip away one's humanity. Circe's enchantments tested not only the bodies of men but their identities, forcing them to confront what it means to remain human in the face of overwhelming power. With the initial clash between Odysseus and Circe resolved, the story might seem as though it should end in triumph, the hero outwitting the enchantress, rescuing his men, and departing in victory. But the tale of Circe does not unfold so simply. Instead of driving her away or escaping her island immediately, Odysseus and his crew found themselves lingering in her halls, and here the relationship between Circe and Odysseus took on a far more complex and unexpected shape. What began as hostility slowly turned into an uneasy alliance, one that blended elements of trust, necessity, desire, and suspicion. After swearing her great oath and restoring Odysseus' men, Circe offered them more than just freedom. She gave them hospitality. In Greek culture, hospitality, or xenia, was a sacred practice, a code binding both guest and host under the watch of Zeus himself. To violate it was to risk divine punishment. Thus, once Circe placed herself under this bond, she was no longer an enemy in the strictest sense. She invited the sailors to bathe, fed them rich feasts, and provided her halls as a place of rest. For men who had known only hardship and hunger since Troy, her generosity must have seemed miraculous. Yet beneath this hospitality lay layers of tension. Could an enchantress who had so recently turned men into swine truly be trusted? Odysseus himself remained cautious, even as Circe drew closer to him. And yet, The narratives tell us, Circe did not merely offer kindness out of fear, she desired Odysseus. Ancient poets described her falling for him, drawn to his cunning and resilience. Unlike the others who had stumbled blindly into her traps, he had resisted her, met her power with his own, and compelled her to yield. In many Greek stories, love, or at least desire, often blossomed from confrontation, and Circe's attraction to Odysseus is one of the most telling examples. Their relationship deepened in ways that still invite debate. Some versions of the myth suggest Circe and Odysseus became lovers willingly, their bond founded on mutual respect and passion. Other interpretations view their intimacy more cautiously, framing it as an extension of Circe's control, with Odysseus compelled into union by necessity rather than choice. In either telling, the outcome was the same. Odysseus and his men did not leave immediately but remained in Circe's halls for a full year. That year was one of strange respite. For the sailors, it meant recovery, abundant meals, and release from fear. They lived as though in a dream, their weariness soothed by Circe's care, their hearts lulled into forgetting the hardships of their journey. For Odysseus, however, the year was more complicated. Though he shared Circe's bed and accepted her guidance, his heart still longed for Ithaca, for Penelope, and for the home that seemed ever distant. Circe could provide comfort, but she could not erase his destiny. This tension infused their relationship with a bittersweet quality, for while Circe offered what no mortal woman could, she also represented a temptation to delay, to forget, to surrender to enchantment. What is striking in this stage of the tale is Circe's transformation from adversary to ally. Once she recognized Odysseus' strength and wit, she ceased to be the threatening sorceress and instead became a guide. She revealed secrets of the sea, warned him of dangers yet to come, and gave counsel that only a being of divine knowledge could offer. Without Circe's wisdom, Odysseus' journey would likely have ended in disaster. She directed him to the underworld, explained the path he must take, and prepared him for trials beyond mortal imagining. Thus, Circe became not a snare but a stepping stone, one of the crucial helpers that every epic hero must encounter on his path. The duality of Circe's role, the one who destroys and the one who aids, is part of what makes her so fascinating. She embodies the fear of feminine power, the allure of forbidden knowledge, and yet also the generosity of a guide who equips the hero for his destiny. In this way, she is not unlike Calypso, another woman who offers Odysseus comfort at the price of delay. But Circe is more dynamic than Calypso, for she does not cling to him against his will. When the time came for Odysseus and his men to leave, she let them go, even helping them take their next step. For the listener, the relationship between Circe and Odysseus holds a dreamlike quality. It is easy to imagine the year on Aaa as one of golden days and enchanted nights, the scent of herbs in the air, the sounds of waves echoing beyond Circe's halls, the firelight casting shadows across marble floors. The men feast, laugh, and rest, while Odysseus wrestles silently with his divided loyalties. One can sense the strange peace of their stay, as though time itself slowed, as though it existed outside the restless movement of the world. But every dream must end, and the longer Odysseus remained, the more his men began to murmur. Their homesickness grew unbearable, their hearts pulled back toward Ithaca. They reminded Odysseus of their duty, of the families awaiting them, of the long years already spent wandering. At last, he could no longer ignore their pleas. He approached Circe and asked her for release. And in this moment, Circe revealed her truest strength, not her ability to enchant, but her willingness to let go. Unlike the sirens, unlike Calypso, Circe did not seek to trap Odysseus forever. She accepted that he must leave, and she prepared him for the journey ahead. In the arc of the Odyssey, this shift marks a turning point. Circe, once a figure of fear, became a figure of knowledge. She is remembered as the sorceress who turned men into pigs, but she is also remembered as the wise guide who directed Odysseus toward his next and most perilous challenge. This dual image, both dangerous and benevolent, has followed her through centuries of retelling. Thus, the story of Circe and Odysseus' alliance is not only about seduction or delay but about the complexity of encounter. Sometimes those who seem most threatening can become the most essential allies. Sometimes the enchantress is not merely a figure of fear but of transformation in a deeper sense, not just of body but of destiny. The moment came, after nearly a year of enchantment and respite, when Odysseus and his men could no longer remain on Aea. Though Circe's halls were filled with warmth, feasts, and a strange kind of peace, the ache of home gnawed at the sailors' hearts. They longed for Ithaca, for wives and children, for the familiar rhythms of their homeland. Odysseus, too, though he shared Circe's bed and enjoyed her counsel, felt the pull of destiny pressing upon him. The sea still stretched wide before him, and his trials were far from over. It was then that Circe, no longer their captor but their guide, prepared them for the next and most harrowing stage of their journey, the descent into the underworld. Unlike other stops in the Odyssey, this was not a voyage to another island or the confrontation of a mortal danger. This was a crossing of boundaries, from the world of the living to the shadowy realm of the dead. For the Greeks, the underworld was not merely a place but a state of existence, a silent and misty land where souls wandered endlessly after death. Few mortals ever entered it and returned. To send Odysseus there was to send him into the deepest darkness of myth, to confront truths that no living man was meant to see. Circe alone could give him the knowledge to survive such a journey. She instructed Odysseus with precision. He must sail beyond the known seas, to the land where Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world, met the boundaries of night. There, in a place where the sun never shone and the earth was draped in perpetual gloom, he would find the entrance to Hades. To open the path, he was to perform a ritual, dig a trench, pour libations of milk, honey, wine, and water, sprinkle barley, and sacrifice black sheep to summon the shades. Only then would the spirits of the dead rise to speak. And among them, Odysseus must seek the prophet Tiresias, the blind seer of Thebes, who alone could reveal how he might return safely to Ithaca. This guidance was more than practical instruction. It was initiation. Circe was sending Odysseus not simply to consult the dead but to confront mortality itself. For the Greeks, to face the underworld was to face the truth of human limits, the inevitability of death, the fragility of glory, and the thin veil that separated the living from the lost. Circe, who had once been his tempter, was now his teacher, ushering him into mysteries reserved for gods and heroes. The preparations for departure were not easy. Though the men had grown used to Circe's hospitality, they trembled at the thought of sailing into the lands of shadow. Their relief at having escaped transformation into swine was soon replaced by dread. Death, after all, was not an enemy that could be fought with sword or shield. Yet Odysseus, steeled by purpose and sharpened by Circe's words, commanded them forward. Their loyalty, though tested by fear, held firm, and they began once more to load their ships. As they made ready to leave, Circe herself did not cling to Odysseus. Unlike Calypso, who would later seek to bind him with love and promises of immortality, Circe accepted the inevitability of parting. She had given him what he needed, both rest and wisdom, and now she stood as one who opens a door rather than one who closes it. There is a quiet poignancy in this moment. The enchantress who once trapped men in bestial forms now released Odysseus into his most perilous quest, arming him not with spells but with knowledge. The departure scene carries a dreamlike quality. One can imagine Circe on the shore, her robe flowing in the sea breeze, watching as Odysseus' black ship cut away from the island. The lions and wolves of Aea, once men themselves, may have prowled silently at her side, witnesses to the departure of the mortal who had bested their mistress. Behind the sailors lay the enchanted island, with its meadows and forests and halls filled with firelight. Before them stretched the dark waters that led to Hades, waters that no ordinary man would dare to sail. Circe's role here cannot be overstated. She is not only the sorceress who ensnared Odysseus' men but the one who pointed him toward his fate. She represents transition, liminality, the moment when a hero moves from temptation to revelation. In giving him the tools to descend into the underworld, she marked his passage from wanderer to seeker, from warrior to pilgrim of truth. Without her, Odysseus would have wandered blindly, perhaps forever lost at sea. With her, he had a map to the most dangerous knowledge a man could carry. And so the bond between Odysseus and Circe concludes not with bitterness but with mutual recognition. She, once his adversary, became a vital part of his story, remembered not only for her dangerous spells but for her crucial guidance. As his ship pulled away, it was not enchantment he carried from her island but wisdom, a rarer and more lasting gift than even the comforts of her bed or table. For the listener drifting into sleep, this episode carries a quiet, lingering resonance. The image of departure, of a ship gliding away from a golden island into dark seas, mirrors the journey of the mind itself, leaving the brightness of waking thoughts for the mysterious landscapes of dreams. Circe fades into the distance, her song echoing faintly, and the hero sails onward toward the shadowy threshold of the underworld, carrying with him the lessons of transformation, caution, and foresight that she has given. At last, Odysseus and his weary companions reached the shores of that distant, twilight land, where the living world brushed against the silence of the dead. The air itself seemed different there, thick, damp, and still, as if sound dared not linger too long. No birds sang in those skies, no winds stirred the waves. Instead, a grey stillness hung heavy, as though the sun had forgotten to shine upon that place. The sailors, hardened by storms and monsters, trembled at the sight. They knew they had ventured beyond the lands of men into the borders of eternity. Following Circe's instructions with careful reverence, Odysseus led his men inland until they found the appointed ground, a barren, rocky field cut by the slow trickle of black waters. Here he ordered them to dig a trench, deep enough to carry the libations and the blood of sacrifice. They moved in silence, their fear manifest in every nervous glance. Each man sensed the nearness of unseen eyes watching from the veil of shadows. When the trench was ready, Odysseus performed the sacred rites exactly as Circe had taught him. Into the earth he poured honey mixed with milk, then sweet wine, then water, each offering forming dark rivulets in the soil. He scattered barley upon it, praying to the souls of the departed and to Hades, lord of the underworld, and to dread Persephone, queen of the dead. The men stood close behind, their eyes darting at every flicker of shadow, every shift of air, as if expecting the unseen to leap upon them at any moment. Finally came the sacrifice. 2 black sheep, brought for this purpose, were slaughtered by Odysseus' steady hand. Their blood flowed into the trench, dark and gleaming, and at once the stillness changed. The earth seemed to shiver, and from the shadows all around there rose a sound like wind moaning through a cave, except it was not wind, but voices. Countless voices, thin and hollow, the cries of the dead, gathering hungrily toward the offering of blood. The shades emerged in silence at first, formless, dim figures, pale as mist. They pressed toward the trench in a restless throng, their empty eyes fixed upon the stream of sacrifice. Each seemed to reach, desperate for the life that pulsed in the blood, for the warmth they no longer possessed. Odysseus' men recoiled, gripping their swords though they knew steel could not cut what had no flesh. Even Odysseus himself felt the chill of dread run down his spine, for never before had he stood among the countless generations of the dead. But he was a man of resolve, and he knew what he must do. Drawing his sword, he stood guard over the trench, forbidding any shade to drink until Tiresias, the prophet, had appeared. One after another, souls came forward, some familiar, some unknown. Among the first was Elpenor, one of Odysseus' own companions, who had died in Circe's halls by a tragic fall. The sight of him stunned Odysseus, so freshly dead, his body unburied and dishonoured, his spirit already wandering in shadow. Elpenor begged his captain to return to Io, to burn his body with proper rites, and to set a marker upon his grave so that he might find peace. Odysseus, grief-stricken, swore that he would do as his fallen comrade asked. Then came Antigone, Odysseus' own mother. The shock nearly broke him. When he had set sail from Ithaca, she was alive, waiting for his return. Yet here she stood, pale and fragile as a dream, her eyes filled with sorrow. He longed to embrace her, to feel her warmth again, but when he reached out, she slipped like smoke through his arms. They spoke across the trench, her voice carrying both comfort and despair. She told him of Ithaca, of Penelope's grief and steadfastness, of Telemachus growing into manhood without his father's guiding hand. And she told him of her own death, that her heart, broken by longing for her son, had carried her down to Hades. Odysseus wept then, a rare moment when the great hero's strength faltered before the weight of love and loss. Yet even amid sorrow, he kept his purpose. More shades pressed forward, heroes of old, women who had loved gods, warriors who had fought in Troy. Their stories swirled around him like a chorus of memory, each tale a reminder of glory, of suffering, of the fleeting nature of life. But Odysseus guarded the trench fiercely, allowing none to drink until the prophet came. He held fast to the discipline Circe had taught him, knowing that this was the moment upon which his fate depended. At last, Tiresias appeared. Blind in life yet all-seeing in death, the prophet approached with slow, deliberate steps. His shade was more distinct than the others, as though wisdom itself lent him shape and weight. Odysseus lowered his sword and allowed him to drink of the sacrificial blood. Instantly, Tiresias' voice rose, clear and commanding, stronger than any of the restless wails around them. He revealed to Odysseus the path that lay ahead, the dangers of Poseidon's wrath, the temptation of the cattle of Helios, the trials yet to come. He warned him that only through restraint, humility, and reverence for the gods could he hope to see Ithaca again. The counsel of Tiresias was not simply a prophecy but a mirror of Odysseus' own struggles. He had always been clever, resourceful, and daring, but his greatest test would be self-mastery, the ability to resist pride, greed, and recklessness. In this, the underworld became not only a place of darkness but of revelation, a place where Odysseus learned that the true enemies of his journey were not only monsters and storms but also the flaws within his own heart. For the audience drifting toward sleep, this episode unfolds like a haunting dream. One can almost hear the murmurs of the shades, the hush of wings in the dark, the drip of blood into the trench. It is a scene of mystery and dread, but also of deep reflection. Here, Odysseus does not merely battle or escape, he listens, learns, and confronts the truths of mortality, love, and fate. The underworld teaches him that every choice carries weight, and that to return home is not only a voyage across the sea but a journey of the soul. When Odysseus and his companions left the shadowed land of the dead, their hearts were heavy with all they had seen and heard. The sea stretched out before them once more, but it was no longer the same voyage as before. Something within them had changed. Odysseus, carrying the words of Tiresias in his mind, felt both burdened and strengthened. He knew now the dangers that awaited him, yet he also carried the clarity of prophecy, a sense of direction even amid uncertainty. The men rowed in silence, each haunted by the whispers of the shades, the image of their fallen comrade Elpenor, and the chilling presence of the countless souls that had brushed against the living world. Their sails caught the wind, carrying them towards Circe's island once again. The journey back to Ae was marked by a strange quiet, as though even the sea wished to give them time to reflect. When at last they reached the familiar shores, Circe awaited them. She welcomed them without surprise, for she had foreseen their return. There was no hostility now, only a calm, almost maternal presence. She knew they carried with them the weight of the underworld, and she treated them with the gentleness of one who had guided mortals through a trial few could endure. Odysseus kept his promise to Elpenor. With solemn hands, his men built a pyre of wood, placing their comrade's body upon it. They lit the flames, and the smoke curled skyward, a bridge between the living and the departed. They laid his oar upon the grave as a marker, a symbol of his life as a sailor and companion. The ritual, though simple, brought peace to them all. For in honoring Elpenor, they felt they had not left him abandoned among the restless dead. The air seemed lighter after the smoke cleared, as though his spirit had finally been released from its sorrow. Circe, true to her role as both enchantress and guide, once more offered her aid. She listened to what Odysseus had seen and heard, and she reminded him of the warnings Tiresias had given. But she also went further, offering counsel of her own. She spoke of the sirens, whose voices lured sailors to their deaths upon sharp rocks. She told of Scylla, the six-headed monster who dwelled on one side of a narrow strait, and of Charybdis, the whirlpool on the other side, whose hunger swallowed whole ships into the abyss. Each choice, Circe warned, would demand courage and sacrifice. There would be no safe passage, only the path that required wisdom in knowing which danger to face. The men listened in hushed silence, their faces pale. To fight monsters was one thing, but to know that their captain must choose which doom to embrace weighed heavily upon them. Odysseus himself felt the gravity of Circe's words. He was a man accustomed to clever escapes, but here he would be asked to accept loss, to steer through dangers where no strategy could save everyone. Circe, with her calm gaze, seemed to see this truth within him. She reminded him that even the greatest of mortals could not master every fate, that strength lay also in endurance, in the ability to continue even when the cost was high. That night, Circe once again welcomed them into her halls. But the mood was different from before. There was no feasting, no enchantment. Instead, there was a kind of stillness, as if her home had become a sanctuary of preparation. Odysseus sat long into the night, gazing at the flickering fire, weighing the choices that lay ahead. His men rested, some in uneasy dreams, others staring into the shadows with restless minds. All of them knew that the sea ahead was growing more perilous. When dawn came, Circe provided them with fresh supplies, filling their ship with provisions for the journey. Her parting words were steady and solemn. She reminded Odysseus not only of dangers but also of what awaited if he and his men gave in to folly. The cattle of Helios, she warned, must not be harmed, for the sun god's wrath was merciless. Her voice carried the tone of finality, as though this was the last time she could shield them with her wisdom. Beyond this point, they would be alone with fate, with only their wits and will to carry them forward. As they pushed off from the shores of Aea for the last time, the men cast lingering glances back at the island. It had been a place of danger, yes, but also of strange refuge. Circe had been both a captor and a protector, a woman whose power was bound with compassion and with mystery. For Odysseus, leaving her behind was bittersweet. She had aided him in ways no other had, yet her world was not his. His heart was fixed upon Ithaca, upon Penelope and Telemachus. And so he turned his face to the horizon, to the long road still ahead. This moment in the tale is a pause before the storm. The underworld had revealed truths, and Circe had prepared them for trials to come. But it was not yet time for confrontation. Instead, it was a moment of calm, solemn, reflective, and tinged with the quiet strength that comes when one accepts the weight of destiny. The men carried new burdens, but also new resolve. They had honored the dead, received the wisdom of gods and prophets, and now, with heavy hearts but steady hands, they were ready to sail once more into the unknown. This pause, framed by ritual, counsel, and farewell, allowed the story to breathe. For listeners settling into rest, it mirrors the deep sigh one takes before sleep, a surrender to what must come, an acceptance that the path may be hard but must still be walked. The waves that carried them away from Circe's island seemed to echo this rhythm, steady and eternal, like the heartbeat of the sea itself. The sea was calm as Odysseus and his companions set sail once more, yet in that calmness there was no comfort. It was the kind of stillness that carries a warning, a hush before something hidden reveals itself. The men worked at the oars with steady rhythm, their faces drawn tight with the memory of Circe's final words. They knew now that each league of sea carried them closer to dangers from which few ever returned. Odysseus stood at the prow, eyes fixed on the horizon, his mind turning over the enchantress's counsel again and again, shaping in his heart the resolve he would need for what lay ahead. The first test they faced was the call of the sirens. Circe had told him of these beings, half woman and half bird, who sat upon jagged rocks in a lonely stretch of sea. Their song was unlike any earthly melody. It promised knowledge, pleasure, and beauty beyond mortal comprehension. Sailors who heard it lost all will to resist, steering their ships toward the rocks where waves shattered wood and bone alike. No man who heard the sirens ever returned home, Circe had said, unless he took precautions. Odysseus, remembering this, prepared his men carefully. He took the soft wax Circe had provided and warmed it in his hands until it grew pliable. One by one, he pressed the wax into his sailors' ears, sealing them against the deadly song. They trusted him, though their faces showed unease. To be deaf upon the sea, unable to hear the waves, the creak of oars, or the voice of their captain, was to feel cut off from the world around them. Yet they submitted, for they knew the danger was greater than their fear. For himself, Odysseus chose another path. His heart burned with the curiosity that had always driven him, an insatiable desire to know, to experience, to test the boundaries of human strength and wisdom. He could not resist the temptation to hear the sirens' voices, though he also knew the risk it carried. So he ordered his men to bind him tightly to the mast of the ship. They lashed him with ropes until he could scarcely move, and he gave strict command. No matter how he might plead or order otherwise, they must not release him until they had passed beyond the sirens' reach. With preparations made, they rowed onward into the dangerous waters. The sea itself seemed to shift as they drew near, the air thickening with an otherworldly presence. And then, faint at first, came the song. It drifted across the water like a breeze of perfume, delicate, alluring, impossible to ignore. The sailors, sealed in silence by wax, rowed on unaware, their eyes fixed forward. But Odysseus, he heard. The song wrapped around him like silk, each note piercing to the core of his being. It was no ordinary music but a voice that seemed to speak directly to his soul. The sirens called him by name, promising knowledge of all the world, of the battles of Troy, of the fates of gods and men, of every secret that had ever been whispered beneath heaven. They promised him joy without pain, wisdom without struggle, a place among the immortals in memory and in song. To a man who had already seen so much, who yearned for understanding beyond what mortals could bear, the temptation was unbearable. Odysseus strained against his bonds, crying out to his men, begging them to steer the ship toward the voices. His face contorted with desperation, his eyes wide with longing. He promised them riches, swore by the gods, commanded as their leader. But his men, deaf to both his words and the siren's call, kept their oars steady. They rowed with calm determination, refusing even to glance back at their captain. The ropes cut into Odysseus' flesh as he pulled against them, yet no amount of force could free him. The siren's song grew stronger as they drew nearer, swelling like a tide. From the deck, Odysseus could see them now, two figures perched upon sharp rocks, their faces beautiful, their forms both familiar and strange, like women shaped from wind and wave. Their eyes gleamed with hunger disguised as tenderness, and their wings, though still, seemed poised to sweep men into ruin. They sang and sang, their voices rising like the cry of eternity itself. And then, as the ship glided past, their song faltered. The notes stretched, broke, and faded into silence. At once, the spell was broken. Odysseus sagged against the ropes, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding with both terror and awe. He had heard what no mortal was meant to hear, and though it nearly destroyed him, he had survived. The sailors, still deaf, rowed on until Odysseus signaled with nods and gestures that the danger had passed. One by one, they removed the wax from their ears, blinking as sound returned, the crash of waves, the groan of timbers, the weary sigh of their own breaths. They looked at their captain, still bound and trembling, and understood the ordeal he had endured. There was no boasting from Odysseus in that moment. Instead, there was silence. The memory of the song lingered in his mind like a dream too vivid to forget, both wondrous and terrible. He realized then the truth of Circe's warning, that the greatest dangers were not always those of teeth and claws, but of the heart and mind, the temptations that drew a man away from his path. The sirens' voices faded behind them, swallowed by the distance. Ahead lay new trials, but for the moment there was only the rhythm of the oars, the hiss of the sea, and the wary yet unbroken courage of men who had sailed past death's song. For listeners resting in the stillness of night, this moment becomes a gentle reminder that even the sweetest promises may conceal peril, and that strength often lies not in yielding to desire, but in enduring it. The ship moved forward, steady and strong, into the unknown waters where darker dangers still waited. The sea ahead narrowed into a strait, a corridor of water caught between two immense dangers. Circe's words echoed in Odysseus' mind like the tolling of a bell. On one side waited Scylla, the six-headed horror whose neck stretched long and thin from her cavern's mouth, each head bearing sharp fangs eager for flesh. On the other side churned Charybdis, the monstrous whirlpool, a maw of water that swallowed the sea itself and spewed it out again in thunderous torrents. To sail too near Scylla meant the loss of men, to draw too near Charybdis meant the loss of the ship entire. It was not a question of escape, but of choice. As they approached, Odysseus gathered his men close. He did not tell them the full truth of what awaited, for what use was fear to sailors already stretched thin with dread? Instead, he spoke to them of courage, of keeping their oars steady, of trusting in him as their captain. He ordered them to row with all their strength and to keep their eyes fixed ahead, not upon the cliffs, not upon the roaring sea. His voice was firm, carrying a calmness he did not feel, but one that steadied their hands. Within his heart, however, the burden pressed heavily. He alone knew the sacrifice that must be made. The ship glided into the narrowing strait, the cliffs rising sheer on either side. Shadows deepened, and the water beneath them grew restless, pulled by unseen forces. To the right, the waves began to heave and swirl, the sea dragging itself downward into a pit as though the world itself were being swallowed. Spray shot upward like the breath of some unseen beast, and the sound was deafening, a roar of water collapsing upon itself. Charybdis was near, and the very sight of her hunger was enough to chill the blood. Odysseus steered away, his eyes locked upon the left-hand cliffs where Scylla lurked. He had taken Circe's advice, better to lose a few than all. And so, though his heart broke at the choice, he guided the ship nearer to Scylla's lair. The cliffs there were dark and jagged, the mouth of a cave yawning high above the sea. The men rowed, unaware, their faces bent toward their work, their arms straining against the pull of the oars. Odysseus alone lifted his gaze, scanning the shadows. And then he saw her. From the cavern's mouth, long necks uncoiled, moving with a terrible grace. One head, then another, until 6 hung over the water, each with eyes glimmering and jaws dripping. They moved silently, like serpents in the air, their hunger focused on the ship below. Odysseus' breath caught in his chest. He wanted to shout, to warn his men, but he knew it would only bring panic. So he gripped his spear and shield, standing tall at the prow though he knew his weapons would be useless against such a foe. Then, with a speed too great to follow, Scylla struck. Her head started down, snapping like lightning, and in a moment 6 men were seized from the deck. Their cries pierced the roar of the sea as they were lifted into the air, thrashing in terror. Odysseus reached upward, his spear flashing, but the heads recoiled before he could land a blow. His men, realizing too late what had happened, looked up in horror as their companions were dragged toward the cavern. The sight burned itself into Odysseus' heart. Men who had survived Troy, storms, and monsters, now shrieking as they disappeared into the darkness of Scylla's den. The ship lurched as the men faltered at their oars, stunned by the suddenness of the attack. Odysseus roared at them to keep rowing, his voice breaking through their terror. With every ounce of will, he forced them forward, away from the cliffs, away from the reach of the monsters' necks. The sea boiled beneath them, the pull of Charybdis close by, but the men, trembling and weeping, bent once more to their oars. Slowly, painfully, the ship slid through the strait, beyond the reach of both horrors. When at last the waters calmed, the sailors collapsed in exhaustion. Their faces were pale, streaked with tears and salt. They mourned the 6 who had been lost, their names whispered into the wind. Odysseus himself stood silent, his heart heavy with guilt. Though he had known it would happen, though he had chosen the lesser evil, the memory of their cries would never leave him. This was the cost of survival, the price of returning home. For all his cunning, for all his strength, even he could not save everyone. In the quiet that followed, the men rowed on as though in a trance. The sea stretched out before them, endless and indifferent, its calm surface belying the horrors they had just passed. Odysseus looked upon his companions, fewer now, and felt the weight of leadership press heavier than ever. He knew more trials awaited, more choices where loss was inevitable. And yet, as the sun broke through the clouds and glimmered on the waves, he also knew they had endured what few mortals ever had. For those listening as the tale unfolds, the passage through Scylla and Charybdis is both terrifying and profound. It speaks of the hard truths of life, that sometimes the path forward is not free of loss, that sometimes strength lies not in defeating the monster but in surviving the encounter, even when survival comes at a cost. The men sailed on, their grief mingling with their courage, while Odysseus carried the memory of what had been taken. The ship did not falter. The oars still struck the water, steady and determined, as though the sea itself urged them forward. And so, scarred but unbroken, Odysseus and his crew passed into the next stage of their long and sorrowful voyage. After surviving the perilous strait of Scylla and Charybdis, Odysseus and his remaining men sailed on, their hearts still heavy from the loss of their companions. The sea seemed to stretch endlessly, vast and indifferent, reflecting the sun in a glare that felt almost oppressive after days of hardship. The men were weary in body and spirit, their oars moving in rhythm more from habit than strength. Even Odysseus, hardened by years of wandering and trial, felt the weight of their collective exhaustion pressing upon him. He knew that the trials were not yet over, that the gods still tested mortals' endurance, and that temptation often came in the guise of comfort. Circe's warning about the cattle of Aelios had echoed in his mind since leaving her island. She had spoken with precision, detailing the sacred nature of the sun god's flocks and the dire consequences of harming them. Odysseus had heeded her words as best he could, reminding his men daily to resist curiosity and hunger. Yet as the days dragged on and provisions dwindled, the gentle discipline that had carried them through past dangers began to fray. The men's stomachs ached with longing for food that the sea and their stores no longer provided. Their eyes wandered, their gazes lingering upon the golden plains that rose above the horizon, where the sacred cattle grazed under the watch of Aelios' unblinking sun. The temptation was subtle at first, a glance here, a whispered suggestion there, but it grew steadily, a quiet pressure pressing upon their will. Hunger is a cruel and patient teacher, and the men's restraint began to crumble. They spoke among themselves in hushed tones, debating the risk. "The cattle are mighty, yes," one said, "but we cannot endure another day on fish and stale bread." Another added, "Surely the gods will forgive us if we take only a few." Odysseus, hearing their murmurs, felt a chill of premonition. He knew that defiance of the gods was never forgiven lightly, and yet he could do little to restrain the gnawing of mortal need. For Odysseus, the challenge was more than a physical test, it was a trial of leadership and foresight. He had survived storms, monsters, and death itself, yet here lay the quietest, most insidious of dangers, the lure of ease and indulgence. Circe had told him that restraint was the mark of wisdom, that only by resisting temptation could a mortal hope to reach home unscathed. But with each passing day, the voices of his men grew louder, their resolve weakening. He reminded them sternly, invoking the sacred oath they had taken to respect the cattle. Still, in the quiet of the night, doubts whispered through their hearts. Eventually, the moment of transgression arrived. While Odysseus slept in a brief and troubled rest, the men gave in to hunger's cruel persuasion. They approached the flocks with furtive glances, their hands trembling as they drove their spears into the sacred animals. The golden cattle fell, their sacred blood staining the earth, and the men ate, not with celebration, but with a grim sense of inevitability. They had tasted what they were forbidden, and in doing so, had summoned the wrath of Aelios, a fury that would not be delayed. The consequences were immediate, though at first subtle. The skies darkened, and the wind, once gentle, shifted into a threatening gust. The sea, calm moments ago, began to churn, as if stirred by the hands of a god. Birds cried overhead, their voices harsh and frantic, and a sense of dread settled upon the crew. Odysseus awakened to this change and realized, with a sinking heart, what had occurred. The sacred order had been violated, and no mortal could escape the anger of Aelios. His warnings, his counsel, his authority, all had failed in this moment. Odysseus confronted his men, anger tempered by sorrow. He did not shout, for he knew that rage could not undo what had been done. Instead, he reminded them of the doom that had been foretold, of the price that must be paid. There was no turning back, no appeal to the gods to lessen the penalty. The men, seeing the fear in his eyes and the weight of the curse, understood too late the gravity of their actions. The sacrifice of their companions, the wrath of the gods, and the trials they had endured were nothing compared to the inexorable consequence of this act. And so the stage was set for the punishment that would come swiftly and without mercy. Odysseus and his men had survived storms, monsters, and death itself, yet their own weakness, their inability to resist temptation, had undone them. For the audience drifting toward sleep, this episode carries a quiet, inevitable dread, not the sudden horror of a monster's attack, but the slow, relentless approach of consequences that cannot be avoided. The story here becomes a meditation on choice, on the fragile line between survival and self-destruction, and on the subtle ways in which humans, even heroes, fall to their own desires. In the soft glow of the setting sun, the golden cattle grazed unknowingly, their fate sealed by mortal folly. Odysseus' heart ached for the men, knowing the punishment would be swift and total. The sea waited, patient and eternal, to exact the debt owed to the gods. This moment marks both the end of respite and the beginning of a reckoning, an event that underscores the enduring tension between mortal desire and divine law, between freedom and responsibility. The morning after the forbidden feast, the sea itself seemed changed. The sun rose pale and reluctant, as though aware of the wrong committed upon the sacred cattle of Helios. Odysseus awoke from a troubled sleep, his eyes immediately searching the horizon. There was a hush upon the waves, a strange stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand. He called to his men, but their faces were pale, and the air was thick with an unspoken dread. The consequences of their disobedience were close at hand, though he had hoped to delay them, to protect what remained of his crew. Odysseus' heart sank as he remembered Circe's words, "The god's wrath is swift and complete, and no mortal can outrun it." Helios, angered by the violation of his sacred herds, would demand retribution. He had warned them of the penalty, the destruction of their ship and the loss of all who had eaten of the cattle. And now, standing upon the deck, Odysseus felt the inevitability of that fate pressing upon him like a storm cloud ready to burst. His men tried to speak, to excuse themselves, but words failed them. Guilt and fear had rendered them mute. The wind began to rise slowly at first, whispering through the rigging, teasing the sails into a shiver. Then came the roar, a sound that made the timbers shiver and the oars tremble in their hands. The sea boiled, each wave higher and sharper than the last, twisting and heaving as if the hand of Helios himself had risen to strike. Dark clouds gathered overhead, blotting out the sun that had nurtured the cattle they had slain. The air was thick with the smell of salt and fear, and the men clutched at each other and the ship, their faces stricken with terror. Odysseus, though grief-stricken, took command. He shouted orders over the roar of the waves, urging his men to secure the ship and brace for the wrath descending upon them. But it was no ordinary storm. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, and the waves rose like mountains, tossing the vessel as if it were but a child's toy. One by one, men were swept into the raging waters, flailing and screaming, their cries swallowed almost instantly by the ocean. The ship groaned under the violence, timbers creaking as if they might snap at any moment. The destruction was complete and merciless. Odysseus could only watch in horror as his companions, brave and faithful, were claimed by divine punishment. Some tried to cling to the wreckage of the ship, but the sea would not yield, casting them back into the abyss. Even those who survived the first waves were soon overcome, pulled beneath by the relentless pull of the god's fury. Helios' wrath was absolute. The sacred order had been violated, and now it demanded its due in full. Odysseus himself remained aboard the ship, gripping the mast with white-knuckled hands, his heart breaking with each life lost. Though he had survived countless trials, storms, monsters, the descent into the underworld, this punishment was the most profound. It was not the cunning of a hero that could save lives from the god's judgment, but only the wisdom to avoid offense in the first place. He had led his men astray, and now they paid the ultimate price. The emptiness of the deck, the silence punctuated only by the roar of the sea, bore testament to the fragility of human endeavor. In the midst of the chaos, Odysseus called out to the gods, pleading for mercy, for some reprieve from the inevitable. But there was none. The storm did not abate, the waves did not lessen. Helios' demand was absolute, unyielding, and the sun god's eyes watched over the carnage with unwavering justice. Odysseus could only endure, clinging to life with every fiber of his being, knowing that survival now meant profound solitude. The death of his men, once companions and friends, became a burden he would carry forever. The hours passed in unending tumult. The storm tore at the vessel, snapping ropes, splitting sails, and tossing the deck into chaos. Odysseus fought to maintain control, to keep the ship upright against forces beyond mortal comprehension. Each wave threatened to end him, each gust of wind seemed sent by the gods to strike him down. And yet, through sheer determination and cunning, he navigated the storm, guided by instinct, knowledge, and a stubborn will to survive. By nightfall, the fury began to ease, leaving Odysseus adrift among the wreckage. The once mighty ship was battered and broken, and all that remained of his companions were fragments, floating timbers, pieces of ore, and memories carried by the waves. Odysseus wept openly, mourning the loss of men who had shared in every trial, every victory, and every hardship of the long journey. The silence that followed was profound, the sea calm now but empty, echoing the solitude that would define the rest of his voyage. For the listener, this moment carries a deep, reflective sadness, a meditation on consequence, fate, and the human cost of error. The story slows, allowing one to feel the weight of loss and the fragile nature of mortality. Odysseus' survival is both triumph and tragedy, a testament to endurance, but also a reminder that no hero can outrun the consequences of defiance against divine law. As dawn broke, the sun timidly rose once more, casting its light upon the sea that had claimed so many. Odysseus floated among the remnants of the storm, the ocean stretching endlessly around him, each wave a whisper of the men he had lost. He was alone, save for the sea, the wind, and the memory of companions who would never return. And yet, within this devastation, a fragile spark of resolve remained. He would continue, he would endure, and he would find his way back to Ithaca, carrying the lesson of loss with him etched deeply into his heart. After the devastation of Aeolus' wrath, Odysseus floated alone on the open sea, surrounded by endless waves that seemed to echo the emptiness in his heart. The wreckage of his ship drifted around him, splintered timbers, shards of ore, and fragments of what had once been a vessel carrying both hope and tragedy. The water was dark, and the sun, which had brought death to his men, now shone weakly, as though reluctant to witness the survivor's suffering. Odysseus clung to a piece of the wreckage, his body battered and aching, yet his spirit, though heavy, refused to surrender entirely. Days passed in an indistinct blur. He drifted with the current, each wave rocking him gently one moment, violently the next. Hunger gnawed at his belly, thirst burned in his throat, yet he endured, fueled by the faintest memory of Ithaca, of Penelope's steadfastness, and of the home that awaited him somewhere beyond the horizon. The sea was both adversary and companion, its unchanging rhythm offering a strange comfort. In the quiet moments between storms, Odysseus would close his eyes and drift into a half-sleep, imagining the faces of his lost companions, their laughter, their camaraderie, the moments of courage and folly that had marked their journey. It was during one of these long, reflective hours that he first glimpsed the island of Ogygia. Rising from the mist, it appeared like a vision, shrouded in twilight, with trees that shimmered and waters that gleamed impossibly green. The island seemed untouched by the cruelty of the wider world, a place where time moved slowly and danger was absent, yet he sensed the presence of something powerful, something divine. Exhausted and near despair, he swam toward the shore, guided by instinct, by the faint hope that he might find rest, sustenance, and perhaps, a reprieve from the relentless solitude of the sea. Upon reaching the island, he found himself in a land of paradox, both welcoming and strange, beautiful yet overwhelming. The air was perfumed with the scent of unknown flowers, the sound of streams trickled gently through groves, and the sunlight filtered through leaves in patterns that seemed almost magical. Odysseus' body ached, and his mind reeled, yet the serenity of Ogygia offered a balm to his battered soul. Here, he could rest, eat, and recover, and for the first time since the loss of his men, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. It was then that he encountered Calypso, the nymph whose power and presence dominated the island. She appeared as if from the very air itself, radiant and commanding, yet with a warmth that invited trust. Her eyes held both curiosity and sorrow, as though she could see the weight of his grief and the endurance it had taken to survive. She spoke to him with calm authority, offering food, shelter, and care. Yet beneath her generosity lay an unspoken truth. She desired him to stay, to become a part of her eternal world, leaving behind the struggles, the mortality, and the pain of the human realm. Odysseus, weary yet wary, accepted her hospitality with measured gratitude. He ate and drank, allowing his body to regain strength, and lay upon soft mats as Calypso tended his wounds. Nights on the island were gentle, with a breeze that whispered through the trees and the distant crash of waves upon the shore. Yet in the quiet of the evening, his mind drifted back to Ithaca, to the home he had longed for through storms and trials, to Penelope whose faith had been steadfast. He recognized the peril of comfort, of allowing himself to forget the journey he had endured and the duty that awaited him. Days turned into weeks, and Odysseus found a rhythm of recovery and reflection. Calypso's presence was a constant, her attention both soothing and suffocating in its persistence. She offered him immortality, a chance to forget the mortal fears and losses that had shaped his life. Yet he resisted, knowing that immortality without the chance to return home, to see his family, to reclaim his kingdom, would be a hollow existence. Each morning he would walk along the shore, looking out across the endless blue, and each evening he would sit beneath the trees, remembering, planning, and holding onto the thread that would lead him back to Ithaca. It was during these reflective hours that Odysseus' character deepened in solitude. He understood, perhaps more than ever, the nature of human suffering and endurance. The loss of his men, the storms, the temptations of Aelio's cattle, and the encounter with the sirens, all these trials had shaped him, teaching lessons no battlefield or monster could impart. Calypso's island, though serene, became a mirror of his own soul, a place of beauty intertwined with constraint, a place where the choice between ease and duty became starkly clear. For the listener, this section of the tale unfolds like a gentle meditation. The narrative slows, the imagery softens, and the emotional depth invites reflection and restfulness. Odysseus' time on Ogygia is not marked by frantic action but by the quiet tension between comfort and purpose, between surrender and the unwavering call of destiny. It is a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of survival, and to prepare for the trials still to come. Ultimately, Odysseus' resolve strengthened. He understood that survival alone was not enough. He must continue, guided by wisdom, courage, and an unshakable sense of home. Calypso, with all her power and charm, could not sway the enduring strength of his human heart. And so, though he rested and healed, the mind of the hero remained vigilant, always looking forward, plotting the course that would eventually take him back across the sea, back to the land that had been his since birth, and to the family who waited with faith and hope unwavering. The day of departure arrived with a quiet inevitability. Odysseus had spent weeks on Ogygia, recovering his strength, reflecting upon the losses that had haunted him, and resisting the gentle yet persistent allure of immortality offered by Calypso. The nymph had cared for him with unmatched tenderness, her voice soft as the waves and her touch soothing as the breeze through the trees. Yet even her kindness could not extinguish the yearning in his heart, the unshakable pull of home, of Ithaca, of the life that had been waiting for him through all the years of wandering and trial. Calypso, though sorrowful, understood that the mortal heart is bound to duty and desire in ways that even divine power cannot override. She led Odysseus to the shore, where a small raft awaited, carved with care and strong enough to bear him across the uncertain waters. She offered him provisions, tools, and clothing, ensuring he would survive the journey, even though she knew the sea would be merciless. Her eyes, luminous with emotion, conveyed both pride and grief, the acknowledgement of a bond formed in solitude and hardship, yet also the understanding that it must end. Odysseus embraced her, a gesture of gratitude, respect, and farewell. There were no words that could fully capture the complexity of their time together, the comfort, the care, the quiet reflection, and the unspoken longing. Calypso nodded, stepping back to watch him take to the raft, her form framed by the shimmering water and the soft, green light of her island. She remained silent, as though giving him the space to leave without further entanglement, and Odysseus, with a mixture of sorrow and resolve, began to push off from the shore. The sea welcomed him once more, vast and infinite, its surface reflecting the sky in endless shades of blue. The raft, though small, carried him with dignity, and the steady rhythm of the waves became a lullaby, rocking him forward. Odysseus' body was stronger now, renewed by rest, yet his mind remained heavy with the memory of all he had endured, the deaths of his men, the trials of monsters, the temptations that had tested his will, and the loss of time itself. Every stroke of his arms against the water was both effort and meditation, a ritual in endurance and reflection. Days passed in this rhythm, with only the horizon and the occasional call of birds for company. Odysseus' thoughts wandered to Ithaca, imagining the contours of the land, the familiar hills, the olive groves, the palace, and the faces of those he loved most. His longing was tempered by caution, for the sea, as ever, remained capricious. Storms could rise without warning, currents could drag him astray, and unknown perils lingered beneath the surface. Yet his focus remained steady, his desire unwavering. He knew that every stroke brought him closer to home, closer to the life that had been his since birth. One night, as he drifted beneath the stars, Odysseus felt the gentle tug of fate guiding him forward. The constellations above seemed to form a map, each star a point of reference in the vast ocean, and he followed them with practiced skill and quiet reverence. He allowed himself small moments of reflection, on companions lost, lessons learned, and the indomitable resilience of the human spirit. In these moments, the story slows, drawing the listener into the soothing rhythm of the sea, the lapping waves, and the gentle pulse of life continuing despite loss and hardship. Yet even as the journey continued, danger was never far. The sea could shift from calm to storm in an instant, and Odysseus remained vigilant, his senses alert to every change in wind, water, and sky. The raft was small and the horizon vast, but his resolve carried him forward. In solitude, he discovered the depths of his own endurance, the strength that comes not from brute force but from patience, ingenuity, and unwavering focus. He rationed food and water carefully, making each moment of the journey a meditation on survival and the preciousness of life. As the days turned into nights and back into days, Odysseus' mind also turned inward. He reflected upon the gods' interventions, the lessons of Circe, the fatal allure of Aelio's cattle, and the ultimate cost of mortality. Each memory was like a wave, rising and falling in his consciousness, shaping his understanding of the world and his place within it. He recognized that the voyage was as much about the mastery of self as it was about reaching Ithaca. Strength, wisdom, and restraint, the qualities he had honed through suffering, would guide him through the final stages of the journey. By the time the land of the Phaeacians appeared on the horizon, Odysseus was transformed. The solitary voyage had tempered his mind and spirit as surely as the sea had tested his body. He approached the coast with cautious hope, aware that the final leg of the journey, the return to Ithaca, would require not only skill but also cunning and patience. The experiences of Ogygia and the open sea had taught him endurance in solitude, the quiet power of reflection, and the gentle, almost meditative rhythm of survival against overwhelming odds. For the listener, this passage is both calming and inspiring, a reflection on the quiet strength required to endure loss, the beauty in resilience, and the slow, patient unfolding of a hero's journey. The sea carries Odysseus forward, and in the gentle rocking of the raft, in the whisper of the wind and the steady pulse of waves, one can sense the heartbeat of the story itself, a tale of survival, reflection, and the inexorable pull of home, whispered softly into the night to lull the mind into calm contemplation. Odysseus approached the shores of the Phaeacians' land with both caution and weary hope. The coastline rose gently from the water, dotted with olive groves and small villages, and the harbor glimmered in the sunlight like a jewel set upon the earth. After so many days adrift upon the sea, the sight of solid land felt like a promise, a soft reassurance that the world of mortals and safety still existed. Every step he took along the sand, dragging his small raft ashore, was a quiet triumph, a small reclaiming of the body and spirit that the sea had so relentlessly tested. The Phaeacians themselves were a peaceful and curious people, skilled in seafaring and known for their hospitality. Odysseus observed them from a distance at first, wary and cautious after years of encountering strangers whose intentions were often dangerous or deceitful. Yet there was something in their demeanor, a kindness in their gestures and a gentleness in the way they moved through their village, that reassured him. The very air seemed infused with calm, and the sound of children playing along the shore, the murmur of conversations, and the rhythm of daily life offered a strange, soothing melody that contrasted sharply with the tumultuous seas he had endured. Eventually, he was discovered and brought before King Alcinous and Queen Arete, rulers of the Phaeacians. Their palace was magnificent but not ostentatious, a place where order and beauty coexisted with warmth and welcome. The king's voice was steady and commanding yet kind, while the queen's eyes held curiosity tempered with wisdom. They listened attentively as Odysseus introduced himself in cautious, measured words, recounting little of his past, speaking instead of his desire merely to rest and recover. Their response was gracious, offering him food, clothing, and shelter, but also inviting him to share his story fully in time. For Odysseus, these moments of calm were restorative. He bathed in the clear waters, ate nourishing meals, and allowed himself to rest, his body finally free from the constant tension of survival at sea. Yet even in comfort, his mind remained alert, reflecting upon the years of wandering, the losses of his men, and the countless lessons imparted by gods and monsters alike. Each memory was a gentle tide in his consciousness, rising and falling with emotion and insight. The Phaeacians' gentle attention allowed him the space to process his experiences, to remember and to understand the journey he had endured, and to gather the strength necessary for the final leg toward Ithaca. In the evenings, the Phaeacians gathered to listen to stories and songs, and Odysseus' presence among them offered a quiet resonance with their love for tales. Though he remained cautious about revealing his true identity too soon, he was captivated by the way storytelling itself seemed to create bonds, to soothe hearts, and to convey wisdom across generations. This reminded him of his own journey, the way knowledge, courage, and endurance had been passed through experience, through observation, and through the stories of others. He began to understand that the final guidance toward home would not come solely from his strength or cunning, but also from the gentle intervention of those willing to help. King Alcinous, recognizing the depth of Odysseus' trials, consulted with his people to prepare a ship strong and swift enough to bear him safely across the remaining seas. The Phaeacians, skilled in navigation and known for their craft, adorned the vessel with care, ensuring provisions were plentiful and the journey secure. Odysseus observed the preparations, feeling a quiet gratitude mixed with anticipation. For the first time in years, he felt that the final stage of his long voyage might be within reach, guided by the steady hands of those whose lives were intertwined with the sea in ways both practical and harmonious. During the nights he spent among the Phaeacians, Odysseus often walked along the harbor, listening to the water lap against the hulls of their ships and watching the stars reflected upon the gentle waves. The rhythm of the sea here was different, controlled, harmonious, a far cry from the wild fury that had claimed so many lives before. These moments allowed him to meditate upon the fragility of existence, the value of trust, and the quiet power of community. He realized that survival was not only a matter of skill but also of connection, of accepting guidance and aid from those who could offer it without hidden intent. Finally, when the ship was ready and the crew prepared, Odysseus stood at the prow once more. The Phaeacians had provided what he could not command himself, a vessel to carry him swiftly and safely toward Ithaca. Though he was still a mortal at the mercy of wind and wave, he felt an inner peace, the calm of knowing that help had arrived in just the right measure. He embraced his benefactors in gratitude, acknowledging their generosity and wisdom, and then, with steady hands, guided the ship out into the open waters. The horizon stretched wide before him, the promise of home glimmering faintly in the distance, and the gentle sway of the Phaeacian vessel carried him forward like a lullaby, soft and insistent, toward the fulfillment of a long and arduous journey. For the listener, this section is immersive yet calming, a meditation on relief, reflection, and preparation. The gentle rhythms of human kindness, quiet observation, and the subtle reassurance of community create a sense of safety and comfort, contrasting the violent trials of earlier sections. It prepares the mind for the final chapters, emphasizing the quiet strength that comes from guidance, patience, and the enduring pull of home. Odysseus' heart raced, yet beat with a quiet, controlled rhythm, as the outline of Ithaca finally emerged on the horizon. The island had remained unchanged in its contours, though much had changed within him. Years of wandering had carved wisdom, sorrow, and endurance into his very being, and he approached the shores not as a young, brash warrior returning from Troy, but as a seasoned, reflective hero tempered by loss and experience. The familiar cliffs and olive groves seemed almost surreal, a vision both comforting and haunting, carrying the weight of all that he had endured and all that he had lost along the way. The Phaeacian ship moved silently over the calm waters, carrying him steadily toward home. Odysseus observed the coastline with careful attention, noting hidden coves and familiar landmarks. The sound of lapping waves and the gentle cries of seabirds created a lull of calm, yet beneath the surface of serenity, his mind was alert, anticipating the challenges that would greet him on land. He knew that homecoming was never simple for a hero. Time, fate, and human affairs had shifted during his absence, and the palace he remembered might not yet recognize him. Patience, cunning, and careful observation would be required before revealing himself. As the vessel neared the shore, Odysseus allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. He thought of Penelope, whose steadfastness had been a guiding star throughout his journey. He imagined her weaving at her loom, waiting, grieving, yet unwavering in hope. He remembered the crew lost to monsters, storms, and divine punishment, their faces etched in memory, and he felt the deep sorrow that lingered despite his anticipation of home. This meditation strengthened him, reaffirming that survival alone was not enough. He must return with purpose, strategy, and clarity to reclaim what was rightfully his and honor those who had sacrificed along the way. Once ashore, Odysseus moved cautiously, blending with the familiar terrain while remaining unseen. He observed the suitors who had overrun his palace, their laughter, their arrogance, and their disregard for hospitality and order. From a distance, he studied Penelope's daily routine, her intelligence, and her subtle wisdom that had kept her loyal despite the years of uncertainty. He also noted the servants and allies who remained faithful, recognizing the intricate web of loyalty, deceit, and human behavior he would need to navigate. Each step was deliberate, measured, and guided by both instinct and the hard-earned lessons of his journey. Odysseus' strategy unfolded with precision. He first approached those he could trust, quietly assessing their loyalty and preparing them for the moment when action would be required. He allowed himself small interactions, always careful to maintain the guise of a stranger, to test the waters and observe without revealing the depth of his identity. In these moments, the tension is palpable yet softened by the calm pacing of the narrative, a slow, immersive observation that mirrors the quiet vigilance of someone returning to a place both familiar and fraught with change. The anticipation of recognition and reunion grew, building a gentle tension rather than abrupt drama. Odysseus allowed the palace itself, the surroundings, and the behaviors of its inhabitants to become part of the story. Every glance, every conversation overheard, and every gesture of the suitors provided insight, allowing him to plan with care. The slow, methodical approach contrasts sharply with the violent events of his past journey, emphasizing cunning and patience over raw action. For the listener, this creates a soothing rhythm, a sense of control and deliberation within the narrative, reflecting both the hero's wisdom and the story's immersive storytelling style. When the first moments of direct interaction arrived, Odysseus was ready. He revealed his identity only to a select few who could aid him, allowing the tension to mount gradually. Recognition was a quiet, intimate affair, the subtle raising of an eyebrow, the catch of breath, the soft realization in eyes long accustomed to absence. These moments of acknowledgement carried profound emotional weight, and yet they are conveyed gently, emphasizing reflection and relational insight rather than sudden spectacle. Odysseus' patience, endurance, and cunning throughout his long journey are fully demonstrated here, offering a meditative reward for the listener who has traveled alongside him through storms, monsters, and divine trials. The anticipation of the eventual confrontation with the suitors is tempered by reflection. Odysseus contemplates the necessity of justice, the importance of reclaiming his home and honor, and the careful balancing of wrath with wisdom. He considers the human costs, the lessons of restraint, and the subtle forces that shaped his journey. The narrative remains calm and immersive, encouraging the listener to dwell in the hero's perspective, feeling the weight of his experience and the serenity of careful planning. Every detail, the quiet of the palace, the subdued movements of servants, the watchful eyes of allies, is rendered with a soft intensity that mirrors the slow, hypnotic cadence ideal for bedtime storytelling. In these final approaches, the story emphasizes endurance, wisdom, and observation. Odysseus' journey across the sea, his trials with monsters and gods, and the loss of his companions culminate in a poised and reflective return. The narrative allows the listener to feel both relief and gentle tension, a soft crescendo leading toward the eventual resolution. Ithaca, once distant and almost mythic, is now tangible, yet the story lingers in the quiet moments of preparation, the reflection upon choices made, and the anticipation of what must come next. Odysseus' presence on Ithaca is not simply a physical return, but an emotional and psychological one. It is the calm culmination of years of wandering, the integration of lessons learned, and the quiet assertion of agency and wisdom earned through trial. For the audience, this section provides both soothing imagery and meditative pacing, reinforcing the immersive, bedtime-style storytelling that emphasizes reflection, subtle tension, and the soft thrill of anticipation without resorting to abrupt action. Odysseus had returned to Ithaca not merely as a survivor, but as a hero tempered by years of trials, loss, and reflection. The palace that had once been a sanctuary for his family now teemed with suitors, men who had overstepped the bounds of hospitality, indulged in excess, and disrespected the very order of his home. Yet Odysseus approached this final trial with the patience and cunning that had carried him across stormy seas, through monsters' lairs, and past divine temptation. Each movement, each observation, was deliberate, a careful orchestration of strategy and timing. The atmosphere in the palace was one of normalcy to the untrained eye, but for Odysseus, every glance, gesture, and whisper was a thread in a tapestry he was slowly weaving, a map to reclaim what was rightfully his. He began by observing the suitors, noting their habits, alliances, and weaknesses. They laughed and feasted, unaware of the presence of the man who had endured years of wandering to return home. The air was thick with arrogance and false security, which in turn allowed Odysseus to study without interference. He also took note of the loyal servants, those who had remained faithful despite the chaos. Their quiet dedication provided him with a network of allies within the palace walls, a subtle but vital force that would be essential for reclaiming his home. The careful calibration of observation and patience created a narrative tension that, though gentle, draws the listener into the story's immersive rhythm. Odysseus' first act of subtle reclamation was his disguise. Presenting himself as a beggar, he moved through the palace unrecognized, carrying with him the aura of humility and inconspicuousness. This guise allowed him to interact with both the suitors and his loyal servants, testing reactions, gathering information, and planting the seeds of his eventual plan. The contrast between his internal identity as the rightful king and his external appearance as a humble traveler highlighted the theme of wisdom over brute force, patience over impulse, and the quiet power of strategy, a tone perfectly suited to the calm, reflective style of bedtime storytelling. During this period, Odysseus observed Penelope with a mixture of reverence and longing. She moved through her days with grace, intelligence, and careful restraint, navigating the pressures of suitors and uncertainty with unwavering composure. He watched her test the suitors with subtle challenges and riddles, aware that she had not surrendered her agency despite years of hardship. Their eyes met briefly in moments laden with unspoken recognition, though Odysseus' disguise remained intact. These interactions, slow and deliberate, reinforced the narrative's calm, immersive rhythm, allowing the listener to dwell in the quiet tension and emotional depth of the reunion in anticipation of the resolution. Odysseus' plan unfolded with meticulous care. He instructed his loyal servants on their roles, coordinating their actions with the precision of a seasoned strategist. Bows were strung, doorways were secured, and every movement within the palace was choreographed to minimize risk and maximize the effectiveness of his return. The suitors, oblivious to the presence of the man they mocked, were caught in a calm but tense atmosphere, their arrogance serving as both a shield and a trap. The narrative emphasizes patience, subtlety, and intelligence over brute force, creating a slow, immersive rhythm that keeps the listener engaged without sudden shock, aligning perfectly with bedtime storytelling norms. When the moment arrived to reveal his identity, Odysseus did so with deliberate control. He strung his own bow, a feat that none of the suitors could achieve, and used it as both a symbol of legitimacy and an instrument of justice. The act itself was deliberate, measured, and precise, embodying the culmination of years of skill, endurance, and wisdom. Each arrow found its mark not in haste or anger, but with quiet authority, asserting both dominance and justice in a manner that reinforced the narrative's reflective tone. The suitor's downfall unfolded methodically, a contrast to the chaos of storms or divine wrath that had marked Odysseus' earlier journey. This measured execution, guided by careful strategy and forethought, emphasized the hero's intelligence and patience rather than impulsive violence. Loyal servants and allies assisted discreetly, ensuring the plan's success while maintaining the calm, immersive flow of the story. For the listener, this sequence evokes tension without fear, a soft crescendo of justice and resolution that aligns with the gentle, meditative pacing expected in sleep-focused educational storytelling. Throughout the confrontation, Odysseus also considered the balance of justice and mercy. While he acted decisively against the suitors, he preserved the dignity of those who had remained loyal, acknowledging their role in sustaining his household and supporting his rightful claim. This attention to fairness and discernment reinforces the theme of wisdom tempered by experience, a calm moral reflection that deepens the listener's engagement without disrupting the story's relaxing tone. Finally, the palace fell silent. The chaos of years, disorder, disobedience, and uncertainty had been brought under control. Odysseus reclaimed his throne not merely through force, but through patience, strategy, and the measured application of skill. The quiet aftermath allowed for reflection on the lessons of endurance, the consequences of arrogance, and the rewards of wisdom and patience. For the listener, this calm resolution mirrors the soothing cadence of the hero's journey itself, offering a gentle sense of closure while still honoring the depth and complexity of the narrative. In these final moments, Odysseus also began to reconcile with Penelope. Their reunion, though understated, was profound, a testament to loyalty, intelligence, and love persevering through time and trials. The narrative emphasizes subtle emotional recognition over overt dramatics, allowing the story to linger in the listener's mind with a soft, contemplative resonance. Here, the hero's journey comes full circle, not through spectacle, but through reflection, restoration, and the quiet affirmation of human endurance, patience, and wisdom. Odysseus finally stood in the quiet of his restored palace, the soft glow of the evening sun filtering through the windows and casting long, gentle shadows across the familiar halls. The trials, the losses, and the long years of wandering seemed to settle around him like a deep, calming breath, allowing him to pause and reflect. The silence was profound, broken only by the subtle rustle of leaves outside and the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore beyond. In this stillness, he felt the weight of all he had endured, the storms, the monsters, the divine interventions, and the sacrifices of his companions, and he allowed himself the rare luxury of introspection. Penelope approached, her movements calm and assured, a living testament to patience and unwavering faith. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze lay a world of understanding, recognition, and love unspoken yet deeply felt. Odysseus took a slow, steadying breath, appreciating the quiet intimacy of the moment. There was no need for grand gestures or hurried words. Their reunion was a soft, mutual acknowledgement of endurance, loyalty, and the shared longing that had spanned years of separation. The calm of this moment allowed the listener to feel the gentle relief and fulfillment that comes from the resolution of long journeys, both literal and emotional. Odysseus moved through the palace, noting the small restorations that had taken place during his absence. The walls, though marked by time, bore traces of care and attention. The hearth was tended, and the familiar sounds of domestic life had returned. Even the loyal servants, who had remained steadfast, moved quietly around him, their presence a comforting reminder of loyalty, order, and continuity. The contrast between the chaos of his journey and the serene rhythm of the restored household emphasized the gentle resolution of the narrative, providing a sense of closure and balance for the listener. He reflected on the lessons that had carried him through decades of wandering. Survival required more than strength. It demanded patience, wisdom, and the ability to learn from each encounter, whether with divine beings, monstrous creatures, or the unpredictability of nature itself. The love and faithfulness of Penelope, the guidance of allies like the Phaeacians, and even the gentle kindness of those who had offered help along the way had been crucial in shaping his journey's success. Each moment of reflection reinforced the narrative's calm, meditative tone, allowing the listener to dwell on the virtues of resilience, prudence, and thoughtful action. Odysseus also considered the human cost of his travels. He thought of the companions lost to storms, to divine punishment, and to the temptations and errors that had accompanied their adventures. Their faces appeared in memory as if in soft, drifting visions, and he honored them with silent reverence. These reflections provided depth to the narrative, emphasizing that even the greatest triumphs are intertwined with sorrow and remembrance. For the listener, this creates a gentle, reflective space to contemplate the balance of life, consequence, and perseverance. In the evening, Odysseus and Penelope walked together through the gardens surrounding the palace. The scent of olive trees and flowering plants filled the air, and the soft sound of the sea in the distance added a tranquil rhythm to their steps. They spoke in low, measured tones, sharing thoughts, memories, and quiet hopes for the future. Each word and gesture carried the weight of years apart, and yet the calm intimacy of the moment allowed the burdens of the past to settle gently, like soft sand beneath the tide. This pace ensures that the listener remains immersed in a soothing, reflective narrative suitable for relaxation or sleep. As night fell, Odysseus looked out over the waters that had carried him through so many trials. The stars appeared, one by one, like distant beacons guiding not only travelers but also reflecting the constancy of hope and the gentle flow of time. He understood that his journey, though concluded in a physical sense, had also transformed him inwardly, shaping his character, his wisdom, and his appreciation for the quiet virtues of life. This meditation on personal growth, endurance, and reconciliation provides a soft, philosophical resonance, ideal for bedtime-style storytelling. Finally, Odysseus retired to the familiar comforts of his home, Penelope by his side. The warmth of the hearth, the gentle sounds of the night, and the knowledge of homecoming allowed him to feel a deep sense of peace. He reflected on the extraordinary journey, the encounters with gods and monsters, the temptations and tragedies, and the ultimate restoration of order and balance. The narrative slows here, emphasizing reflection, serenity, and emotional closure, allowing the listener to experience the calm satisfaction of a story fully resolved. In these final moments, the tale of Odysseus, once marked by chaos, loss, and uncertainty, comes to rest in quiet harmony. The listener is invited to dwell in the peace of homecoming, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring power of love, patience, and wisdom. The slow, meditative cadence of the story mirrors the natural rhythms of relaxation and sleep, making it not only a tale of adventure and mythology but also a gentle, immersive experience designed to soothe and comfort.